My name is Natalie, and I'm 29 years old. 5 years ago, my mother chose my stepbrother over me, and that choice cost me everything I thought was permanent. But here's the thing nobody tells you about losing your family. Sometimes the loss teaches you more about yourself than you ever would have learned if they'd stayed. The real story isn't about the moment they abandoned me. It's about what I discovered about myself in the silence that followed, and then what happened when the past walked back into my emergency room one Tuesday night in the middle of a 12-hour shift, asking me to save the life of the person who destroyed mine. Let me start at the beginning, because this isn't a story about a single betrayal. It's a story about how little moments of invisibility add up until they become the foundation of your entire family dynamic, and then one lie becomes the match that burns the whole thing down. And then somehow, through medicine, through determination, through choosing to be someone my family never expected me to be, I became the person they finally had to look at. Before the lie, before the silence, before I understood that my mother would always choose him, I was the kind of daughter who tried so hard to matter that it became pathological. I was the invisible girl in a family that had learned not to see me. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a split house with a split heart. My father, the original one, had left when I was 4 years old. I don't have real memories of him, just a phantom shape at the edges of other people's stories. My mother, Carol, was 32 when he left, angry and determined to build a life that didn't need him. She worked in accounting. She was precise, controlled, and excellent at numbers, but terrible at emotions. We didn't talk about the divorce. We didn't talk about much of anything, actually. We existed in the same house with a kind of polite distance that I learned very early was the way things worked in our family. Then when I was 8, my mother met Robert. Robert had a son. His name was Marcus, and he was 14 years old when he moved into our house, 6 years older than me, with the confidence of someone who'd never learned that he wasn't the center of the world. He was conventionally beautiful in the way that mattered in the late 90s, blonde, athletic, charming in that effortless way that made adults laugh and other kids want to be around him. He was good at everything, but it was the kind of good that didn't require effort. He played soccer well enough to get recruited by a decent college program. He got decent grades without studying. He was the kind of kid who walked into a room and became the focal point without trying. My mother married Robert Sr. when I was 9. Marcus became my stepbrother, though nobody really used that term. He was just Marcus and I was Natalie, and we occupied the same house in a way that felt cordial but distant. He was kind to me the way a 14-year-old boy is kind to his stepsister, which is to say, barely present, occasionally patient, but fundamentally uninterested in the girl who was 8 years younger. But I was interested in him. Not in a romantic way, nothing like that. I was interested in him the way you're interested in something you don't understand but desperately want to crack. He had something I didn't have, attention, not from me but from everyone. His father was obsessed with him. My mother, even though he wasn't her biological son, treated him with a kind of pride that she'd never extended toward me. He was the achievement. He was the proof that Robert was a good father, that blended families worked, that this marriage had been the right choice. I remember the first Mother's Day after they got married. I made her a card in school, one of those elaborate construction paper things with doilies and stickers. I spent hours on it wanting it to be perfect. Marcus bought her a silk scarf that he definitely hadn't chosen himself but had somehow arranged. At dinner, Robert toasted Marcus for his thoughtfulness. My mother cried happy tears over the scarf. My card sat next to her plate, polite but not remarked upon. This is the thing about invisibility. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not like they sit you down and say, "We've decided you don't matter." It's 1,000 small moments of being overlooked until you stop expecting to be seen. I was a quiet kid, not shy exactly but careful. I learned early that drawing attention usually meant disappointment, so I started keeping things small. Good grades, but not so good that they were remarkable. I did activities, soccer, clarinet, art, but nothing that required my parents to actually attend events or participate. I made friends, but I didn't bring them home. I existed as a kind of permanent background character in my own life. My mother worked full-time in accounting, Robert worked in commercial real estate, and Marcus was the solar system around which we all orbited. Not in a cruel way. They weren't neglectful in the way that would get social services called. I was fed, clothed, my tuition at decent schools was paid. But there's a kind of negligence that's quieter than that, more insidious. It's the negligence of not asking, not noticing, not wondering. It's the negligence of assuming everything is fine because you haven't been told otherwise. I turned 13 the year Marcus left for college at the University of Washington. He was 18, and he was going to study business just like his father had, just like everyone expected. He got a scholarship, not for academics but for soccer. His father bragged about this for months. My mother hung his soccer action shots in the hallway, even though one of my drawings from advanced art class was still sitting in the closet in my room, never framed, never hung. When he left, something shifted in the house, not obviously, but the energy changed. My mother started asking me about school, about friends, about things I was doing. It was like she'd suddenly noticed I existed. I was desperate for it in a way that probably wasn't healthy. I started trying harder. I got better grades. I joined more clubs. I developed a joke with my father where we'd call each other on Friday nights and he'd ask me to tell him one interesting thing that happened that week. We both knew he was obligated. Our custody agreement technically included weekly calls, but I pretended the choice was genuine. Sophomore year, I decided I wanted to go to medical school, not because I had some burning passion for medicine, not exactly, but because it was something big, something hard, something that would matter. It was the kind of goal that, once achieved, would make someone have to see me. It would make me impossible to overlook. I was 16 when I told my family about this goal. I did it strategically, picking a moment when my mother was cooking dinner and in a good mood. Robert was at the table doing work emails, and Marcus was home for Thanksgiving break, which meant it was one of the few times we were all in the same room. "I've decided what I want to do," I announced, probably with more drama than the moment warranted. "I want to go to medical school. I'm going to be a doctor." My mother smiled. "That's nice, honey." Robert nodded and went back to his email. Marcus, who was home from college for 5 days and spent most of his time either working out or on the phone with his girlfriend, glanced up and said, "Cool," in that autopilot voice that meant he'd heard me but wasn't actually registering what I said. That was the moment. That was when I should have understood that no amount of achievement would create the attention I craved. But I didn't learn that lesson. Instead, I took that moment of acknowledgement, that nothing moment, and spun it into fuel. I became the kind of student that schools write about in their annual reports. I got a 4 GPA. I took every AP class available. I got a perfect score on my SATs. I volunteered at a local hospital and worked there summers when I was old enough, learning about the actual work of medicine, not just the idea of it. I ran track, not well enough to get recruited but well enough to place in district competitions. I wrote the personal essay for my medical school application with the kind of honesty that probably made the admissions committees uncomfortable, talking about wanting to matter, about wanting to be the person who saves lives, because at least then I'd be seen. And it worked. I got into 3 medical schools, full-ride scholarships to 2 of them. I chose Johns Hopkins because it was far away and prestigious, and because getting there felt like a final declaration of independence. I was 18, and I was going to become a doctor, and the world was going to see me. During the week between graduating high school and leaving for college, my mother took me to lunch, just the 2 of us. It was significant. We didn't do things together very often. "I'm so proud of you," she said, stirring her coffee without looking at me. "This is a big accomplishment. You've worked so hard." I remember holding that sentence like it was made of glass, afraid to move or breathe or blink in case it broke. She was proud of me, finally. "I just want you to know that I believe in you," she continued. "And no matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, you can always come home. We're always your family. That's not something that changes." I nodded, my throat tight, and I meant it when I believed her. I spent my first year of medical school in Baltimore, living in a tiny dorm room that smelled like industrial cleaning products and other people's anxiety. It was incredible and terrifying in equal measure. I was one of the smartest people in the room, which was a completely disorienting experience for someone whose entire identity had been built around trying to prove herself. I made friends. Not close ones, not yet, but people I studied with, people I grabbed lunch with, people who knew my name and asked how my exam went. And I called home every other Sunday. These calls were stilted, overly formal conversations where I'd update my mother on my grades, my schedule, my coursework. She'd tell me about work, about Robert's latest real estate deal, about Marcus's latest achievement, a promotion at the marketing firm where he'd started working, a new girlfriend, an engagement, a wedding, a house purchase. A whole life moving forward while I was stuck in the basement of Hopkins Hospital, learning anatomy from cadavers and how to recognize the sound of a failing heart. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was more that they'd fallen into a rhythm of life that didn't include me, and the distance, both physical and emotional, made it easy to maintain. I was doing well, so there was nothing to worry about. I was busy, so there was nothing to miss. I was building a life that didn't require their participation, which was exactly what I'd been preparing for my entire childhood, even though it hurt when it actually happened. Second year of medical school was when things started to shift again. I was becoming better at the work, more confident, more certain that this path had been the right choice. I was doing clinical rotations, actually working with patients, actually saving lives, and I was good at it. My attendings told me so. The patients responded to me. I had a presence in the hospital that I'd never had anywhere else. I mattered there, I was seen. I also met Dr. Sarah Chen, who would become the most important person in my life. Sarah was a third-year resident when I was a second-year student, and she took me under her wing in a way that nobody else ever had. She was the first person to look at me and see not the invisible girl trying to prove herself, but an actual person with skills and intelligence and worth. She asked me questions that weren't just obligatory. She invited me to study sessions. She told me I was going to be an excellent doctor, not because I'd worked hard to get there, but because I had something specific, an ability to sit with people's fear and meet them there, instead of trying to fix them out of it. "You listen," she told me once, after I'd struggled through a particularly difficult patient case. "Most of us are so focused on knowing the answer that we forget to actually hear what the patient is saying. You do both." I fell in love with her, and she became my chosen family in a way that felt like salvation. Sarah had come out the year before, and she was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Diana. They had a house in Canton, and they started inviting me over for dinners. Not formal dinners, real ones, the kind where you bring wine and everyone cooks and nobody's checking your grades or comparing you to someone else. Diana was a music teacher, patient and kind, and she treated me like I was simply a person they liked having around. For the first time in my life, I had somewhere I belonged that wasn't based on achievement or performance or trying to be seen. I was just Natalie. That was enough. My mother called right after I started my third year of medical school. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it from anyone else," she said, and my stomach immediately dropped because that's how bad news always starts. Marcus got engaged. I remember the exact emotion I felt in that moment. Not jealousy, but a kind of sad resignation. Of course he did. Of course his life was proceeding forward in the traditional, expected way. He'd graduated, got a job, bought a house, and now he was getting married, all while I was in my 20s, covered in other people's blood and bodily fluids, not sleeping, living off coffee and the fumes of intellectual exhaustion. "That's great," I said, and meant none of it. "His wedding is planned for next June," she continued. "We really hope you can make it. It would mean a lot to him and to us." Next June meant it was a year away. I had no idea what my schedule would look like. Medical school continued to reshape me, demanding things I didn't know I had to give. But I said yes, because that's what you say when your mother asks you to show up. Third year was brutal. Rotations are designed to break you and rebuild you as something different, something harder, more efficient, less invested in your own comfort. I remember going 72 hours without sleep once, working a trauma rotation, trying to keep an 18-year-old kid alive after a car accident. He didn't make it. I went to the on-call room and cried for the only time that entire year, then washed my face and went back to work. Sarah found me in the bathroom. "This part is real," she said. "You're learning that some things are broken beyond your ability to fix them. That's important. That's what separates us from people who break under this job." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "But you're not broken," she continued. "Not yet, don't let this break you." I didn't. I got through third year. I applied for residencies and I got accepted at 2 places, an internal medicine program at Johns Hopkins and an emergency medicine program at Massachusetts General Hospital. I chose emergency medicine, and I chose Mass General because it was the hardest, the most intense, the most demanding, and also because it was far away from home and I was still running. I was 25 years old when I started my residency at Mass General, and I was finally becoming the person I'd been preparing to be my entire life. I worked 80-hour weeks. I managed patients who were on the edge of death. I learned how to think fast and act faster, how to make decisions when you don't have all the information, how to triage the chaos of emergency medicine into something that made sense. I was excellent at this work. I was seen by colleagues and patients and superiors. I mattered in the way I'd always wanted to matter. And I talked to my family exactly 3 times a year: my birthday, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. Marcus's wedding happened in June. I had a patient who was having complications from a surgery and I couldn't leave. I called my mother and told her I couldn't come. She was quiet for a long moment. "Natalie," she said, and I could hear the disappointment underneath the word. "This is important." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry I can't get coverage." That wasn't entirely true. I could have gotten coverage if I'd been willing to call in favors. But I wasn't willing. I didn't want to go to that wedding. I didn't want to watch Marcus marry someone I'd never met while everyone celebrated the expected, traditional path that he'd taken, while I was covered in other people's crises in a hospital in Boston. "He's your brother," my mother said. "Stepbrother," I corrected, which was unkind and unnecessary, but I said it anyway. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she said, "I hope you'll try harder to stay connected to this family. I know you're busy, but your brother is important." After we hung up, I called Sarah, who met me at the bar near the hospital, and let me drink whiskey and vent about a family that still didn't understand the work I was doing, the person I'd become. She listened without judgment, which is what real family does. "They don't know how to see you yet," she said. "Maybe they will eventually, but don't wait for them to. Build your life in the meantime, build it for you." That's what I did. I worked. I got apartments with roommates who were also residents, and we'd cook dinner and talk about patients and sleep whenever we could. I got close to my colleagues in a way that felt real and present. I volunteered for extra shifts. I got certified in special procedures. I started thinking about what kind of subspecialty I might want to pursue. I became the kind of doctor who people requested specifically. The kind who had patients who improved just because they felt heard by her. I was 27 when I realized I hadn't been home in 3 years. Not to Portland. I'd been to the East Coast, to various medical conferences, to vacations in places that didn't trigger the specific ache of my childhood home. But I hadn't been to Portland. I hadn't sat in my childhood house or seen my childhood friends or walked down the streets I'd walked down when I was invisible. My father called me that November. This was unusual. My father and I had developed a kind of comfortable distance after I'd left for college. We talked occasionally, exchanged emails, seemed to exist in a cordial parallel universe where we acknowledged each other's existence without actually intersecting. "I'm getting married again," he said. Apparently, I had a lot of family members getting married without my attendance. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. My father deserved happiness. He'd just been out of sight for so long that his happiness had become abstract. "I'd really like you to be there," he said. "Your family on my side, my sister is going to be there. My parents, I want them to meet you. I want them to know who you've become." This landed differently than Marcus's wedding invitation had. Maybe it was because my father had never been responsible for my invisibility in the same way. Maybe it was because he was asking me to meet family I'd never known. Maybe it was just that I was tired, and I wanted to believe that someone wanted to see me. When I asked, "August, next August. I know that's a long way off, but I want to give you time to plan." August, 7 months away, I probably wouldn't have time off, but I said I'd try. And then, February of that year, during a shift, everything changed. I was working a night shift, and I was in the middle of a relatively quiet period, which is always dangerous because it's never actually quiet. It's just the moment before the chaos. I was in the break room, getting coffee that was somehow simultaneously too hot and undrinkably bad when my phone rang. It was my mother. She never called me during shift. The protocol was always text, or wait until after I got off. "Natalie," she said, and her voice was different, fractured. "It's Marcus. He's been in an accident. He's at Legacy Emanuel in Portland. They're operating. He's had head trauma. They don't know yet how bad." I remember the coffee cup slipping out of my hand. I remember the sound it made on the tile floor. I remember the strange moment where I was 2 people simultaneously, the doctor who knew exactly what head trauma meant, what the prognosis usually was for the kind of accident that required emergency surgery, and the daughter who was hearing that her family was in crisis. "I'm calling him in," I said to Sarah, who had appeared in the doorway of the break room because that's how Sarah was. She could sense disaster. "Go," she said. "Go, I'll cover your shift, go home." I didn't have a plan for getting to Portland. I didn't have money for a plane ticket that I hadn't planned for. But I called my father, my biological father, the one I rarely called, and I said, I need to get to Portland. Now. He booked me a flight without asking questions. I was in the air 4 hours later, sitting in a middle seat, my hands shaking, trying not to imagine the many ways that head trauma could end. Marcus was 33 years old. He was living a full, successful life. He'd been driving home from a business dinner when someone ran a red light and hit the driver's side of his car. He'd been unconscious when the paramedics arrived. I don't actually remember what my mother said when I called her from my layover. I remember that I was moving fast, operating on adrenaline and fear, the exact same way I operate in the emergency room. I remember landing in Portland at 11:47 p.m. I remember getting to Legacy Emanuel and seeing my mother in the surgical waiting area, looking simultaneously more present and more destroyed than I'd ever seen her. She saw me and stood up, and for a moment I thought she might hug me. Instead, she said, "Thank God you're here, you're a doctor, you can talk to them, you can understand." This was the first time she'd positioned my medical knowledge as valuable. It was the worst possible moment for her to realize it mattered. Marcus had emergency surgery for an epidural hematoma. The surgeons got him in quickly and released the pressure, but head trauma is unpredictable. He was in a medically induced coma, and nobody could say for certain whether he'd wake up or if he did, what he'd be like. He was in the ICU on a ventilator, and he looked smaller than I remembered, which is always shocking because your siblings stay the same age in your memory, and then you see them and realize how much time has passed. "He's got the best chances if he wakes up in the next 48 hours, I said to my mother, explaining things the way I'd explain them to a patient's family member. "His imaging is good, no secondary bleeds, the surgery went well, now it's about recovery." My mother held his hand, and she cried in a way I'd never heard her cry. It occurred to me that she loved him, like truly, deeply loved him. It wasn't just preference or blind spots. She loved him the way I'd always wanted her to love me. I stayed for a week, then 2 weeks, negotiating with my residency program about the time off, working with Sarah to get my shifts covered. Marcus woke up on the 4th day, which was a good sign. He was confused and had some memory gaps and struggled with the physical rehabilitation, but he was alive and he was recovering, and the worst-case scenarios were being crossed off the list. It was during the 2nd week, when I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria eating terrible food, that my mother found me. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, sitting down across from me. "I don't know what we would have done without you. We couldn't understand what the doctors were saying. We couldn't make the decisions. You gave us someone we could trust." I nodded. I didn't say anything. I was waiting for the moment where she'd regret that she hadn't appreciated me before it took a tragedy to make me valuable. "I've been thinking about what happened," she continued. "With you and Marcus, with you moving away, I realized that I didn't support you the way I should have. I was focused on Marcus because he's Robert's son, and I thought I had to prove something. But I haven't been fair to you. You're my daughter. You've always been my daughter. I'm sorry." I heard this the way I'd heard her other half apologies, the ones that came when I'd succeeded at something, and it reflected well on her. This was different, but not different enough. She was sorry because I'd proven myself through crisis. She was seeing me because her other son was broken. "It's okay," I said, which wasn't true, but it was easier than saying the rest. "When you go back," she said, "will you come home for Christmas? Just a few days. I know you work in emergency medicine and the schedule is terrible, but—" "I'll try," I said. The conversation ended there. I went back to the hospital, and I sat with Marcus for a while, watching him sleep, trying to feel something beyond the clinical assessment of his recovery status. He'd been my stepbrother for 25 years, and we were practically strangers. Now he was a patient I was monitoring, and his recovery was becoming something I was invested in, not because he was my brother, but because he was someone I'd been trained to save. I went back to Boston. My mother and I talked more frequently after that, phone calls that had more substance to them, where she actually asked about my work, where she tried to understand the person I'd become. It felt like maybe, finally, the distance was closing. And I was feeding her information about my life in a way I'd never done before. This is the part where I need to be honest about what happened. I wasn't protecting myself. I wasn't being cautious about what I shared. I was hungry for connection in a way that was probably pathological, and I saw her newfound interest as validation, that if I just kept trying, if I just let her in, eventually she'd see me the way I'd needed her to see me my whole life. I told her about my work. I told her about the hardest cases, the ones where people didn't make it, the ones that stayed with me. I told her about my colleagues, including Sarah, and how Sarah had become my closest friend, the person I trusted most. I told her about the guy I was briefly dating, a surgical resident who was kind but ultimately not interested in anything serious. I told her about my apartment, my student loan debt, my dreams of eventually specializing in trauma surgery or critical care. Most importantly, I told her about my insecurities. I told her about moments where I questioned whether I was good enough, whether I was going to make it through residency, whether I'd made the right choice going into emergency medicine. I told her about the patient who died and how it haunted me, and how I wondered if I could have done something differently. She listened. She responded with appropriate concern and encouragement. She began to feel like a mother in a way she never had before. And I thought, finally. Marcus recovered fully. By spring he was back to work, back to his life, back to being the golden child who'd beaten the odds. I'd been the one to make sure he had the best care, the one who'd made decisions when nobody else could. I'd saved his life in a way by being present and knowledgeable when my family needed me to be, and my mother had noticed. She'd said so. In June, my father got married and I went. I met my paternal grandmother for the first time and my grandfather for the second time. I met my aunt and uncle and cousins. I slept in my childhood house for the first time in 3 years, and it felt smaller than I remembered. The hallway with Marcus's soccer photos still hung there, my framed drawing still nowhere to be found. When I left to go back to Boston, my mother hugged me longer than usual. "I'm really proud of you," she said, the way she'd said it one time before when I was 18. "I hope you know that." I wanted to believe it, so I did. This is the dangerous part. This is where I became complicit in my own betrayal. By the time I completed my residency at Mass General, I'd had 3 years of my mother paying attention to me in a way she never had before. 3 years of phone calls and interest and pride. 3 years of feeling like maybe, finally, I'd earned my place in my family. I was 29 years old, and I'd built an incredible life in Boston. I had a job as an attending emergency physician, incredible colleagues, a chosen family in Sarah and Diana, and the respect of a hospital that recognized me as exceptional at my work. But I was still waiting for my biological family's approval. This is embarrassing to admit. I was a grown woman with a successful career, saving lives, making a good living, and I was still hungry for validation from people who'd been content to ignore me when I was struggling. But I was. The hunger never went away. It just got better at disguising itself. In August, I got a call from my mother. It was a Sunday, and I was home reading, trying to rest before a week of night shifts. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I'm not sure how you're going to react." My immediate thought was that it was about Marcus. Maybe he'd had a relapse, maybe something was wrong. "It's about Marcus," she said, confirming my fear, "and about his marriage, and about something that happened a while ago that came to light recently." She proceeded to tell me a story, about how Marcus had apparently been having an affair with his wife's sister for the past 2 years, about how his wife had found out and there was a divorce happening, and it was all very messy and painful. "I wanted you to know because we've all been affected by this," she said. "It's been hard for him, obviously. He's been doing poorly, drinking too much, not taking care of himself. I think he needs his family right now." I listened to this story with the exact right amount of empathy, the kind of empathy that comes from understanding human weakness and trauma. I was the person who heard stories like this professionally, who didn't judge, who helped people through their worst moments. "I'm sorry he's going through that," I said. "That sounds really hard." "I was wondering," my mother continued carefully, "if you might be willing to talk to him, just as a sister, just to let him know that we still support him, that the family isn't abandoning him." She was asking me to be the bridge, to be the person who could understand, who could empathize, who could help my stepbrother through a crisis while maintaining some kind of familial relationship. "Of course," I said, "I can try to reach out." I sent Marcus a text, a simple one, something like, "Hey, heard you're going through something rough. If you want to talk, I'm here." He responded within an hour, "That would be nice. Can we do a call soon?" We talked that week, and he was, as my mother had implied, not doing well. He was angry and ashamed and feeling like a failure. His business was fine, but his personal life had imploded, and he was dealing with it the way a lot of people deal with crisis, with alcohol, isolation, and a kind of self-destructive numbness. I was patient, I was kind. I was everything I'd learned to be in my medical training, present without judgment, strong without being harsh, available without being intrusive. We developed a routine. Every week we'd talk, I'd ask how he was doing. He'd tell me about therapy, about his divorce proceedings, about his attempts to rebuild. And slowly something shifted. Our relationship became real in a way it had never been before. He started treating me like a sister. He asked about my work, my life, my girlfriend Sarah, whom he'd figured out was my girlfriend, though I hadn't officially said so. He was interested in me as a person. And I was hungry for it. This went on for a year. My mother was pleased. Robert would occasionally pick up the phone when Marcus and I were talking and say, "This is good. I'm glad you two are getting closer." I'd gotten the approval I'd been waiting for my whole life, just in a roundabout way, through crisis, through caretaking, through making myself useful to people who'd never asked anything of me before. I was good at this. I was good at being the strong one, the one who could help, the one who could understand. I carried Marcus through his divorce. I was the voice on the phone during his worst nights. I was the person who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. And I didn't see it coming. It was October, exactly 1 year after my mother told me about Marcus's divorce. I was in the emergency room, working a night shift, and I wasn't being especially careful about my phone. I'd checked it during my break, and I had a message from my mother. Nothing urgent, she'd said, but if I got time, she'd love to call. I called her back after my shift, sitting in my car in the parking garage, exhausted and ready to go home. "How are you?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange, careful. "I'm tired," I said. "Long shift, what's going on?" There was a pause, and in that pause I felt something shift, something true. "I've been thinking a lot about Marcus's recovery from the car accident," she said slowly, "and about how much he's changed since you two started spending more time together. He's really grateful for that. He told me, and I want you to know this, he said that you've been the only person who's really believed in him, the only person who made him feel like he wasn't a failure." "I'm glad," I said, confused about where this was going. "He's been through a lot. He deserves support." "The thing is," my mother continued, "and I need to say this delicately, but Robert and I are worried about something." My stomach dropped. I knew this tone. This was the tone of bad news, of things about to break. "Sarah," she said, "we're concerned about how serious your relationship is, about how you've been well. You've been quite public about it at work, I understand. And Marcus mentioned." I cut her off. "Marcus mentioned what?" Another pause, longer this time. "He's concerned that you might be influencing him, that you might be exploring sexuality with him, that perhaps you're not the stabilizing presence in his life that we thought you were, that maybe, given the circumstances of your relationship, you might actually be taking advantage of his vulnerable position." I didn't speak. I couldn't speak. I was trying to parse what she was saying, trying to understand if she was actually accusing me of. "We're not saying that's what's happening," she continued quickly. "But Robert feels very strongly that Marcus needs to distance himself from you for a while, just until he's more stable, just until this divorce is finalized." "Are you serious right now?" I finally managed. "Are you actually calling me to tell me that Marcus thinks I'm, what, grooming him, manipulating him?" "We're not using those words," she said, "but we do think that the intensity of your connection isn't healthy, not given your family history of distance, not given the situation with your alternative lifestyle." There it was, the real thing, not my concern for Marcus, not my involvement in his crisis, the fact that I was queer, the fact that I'd built a life with a woman, that I was unapologetically myself, that I'd stopped pretending to be the straight daughter that would fit neatly into their family narrative. "You're upset," she said. "I understand that, but please think about it from Marcus's perspective. He's vulnerable. Having someone like you, someone so established, so successful, showing him this level of attention, he might be confused, he might be susceptible to." "To what?" I interrupted. "To me being myself, to me being happy, to me sharing myself with someone I love." "To manipulation," she said quietly, "even if you don't mean it that way." I got out of the car. I started walking through the parking garage, needing to move, needing to do something with the rage and betrayal that were flooding through me. "Let me tell you what actually happened," I said. "I spent my entire childhood trying to matter to you. I became a doctor. I got top of my class. I saved Marcus's life when he was in a coma. And the only time you were proud of me was when I was useful, when I was helping someone else, when I was making myself small enough to fit into your narrative." "That's not fair," she said. "It's entirely fair," I continued. "And now that I've finally built a life that has nothing to do with making you comfortable, now that I'm living openly and happily, you're going to weaponize your concern for Marcus against me. You're going to take my care for him and twist it into something predatory because it makes you uncomfortable to have a queer daughter." "Natalie." "And Marcus," I continued, "went along with it, which actually I should have expected. He's never had to face consequences for anything in his life. He's never had to grow up. He just has to call me a predator and you'll believe him because that's always been the pattern, hasn't it? He gets to be the golden child. I get to be the problem." "That's not what this is about," she said, but her voice was wavering. "Yes, it is. It's exactly what it's about. You can't handle who I am, so you're going to erase me. Again. But this time it's going to feel better because you get to frame it as protecting someone else." I hung up. I sat in my car for an hour and didn't move. I was waiting for the panic to set in, or the tears, or the kind of emotional collapse that comes from this type of betrayal. But instead I felt nothing. It was worse than feeling. It was a kind of profound emptiness, like I'd been hollowed out, like the thing I'd been feeding my entire life, the hunger for their approval, had finally been satisfied with the knowledge that it would never come. Sarah's phone rang 11 minutes later. My mother had called her. She wanted to discuss her concerns about my relationship with Marcus and whether Sarah thought I was being, and I quote, "appropriate with boundaries." Sarah had listened and then said very calmly, "I think you should talk to your daughter," and had hung up. Sarah came over after she got off her shift. I had texted her the whole conversation because I couldn't actually say it out loud. When she arrived, she didn't hug me or say she was sorry or do any of the things people do when someone is devastated. Instead, she sat down at my kitchen table and asked, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I said. "Do you want to fix this?" she asked. "No," I said, and it was true. I didn't. I was done. I was finally, actually done trying to make myself smaller or bigger or different to fit into their family. I was done being the invisible girl, and I was done being the useful one, and I was done being the daughter who was always waiting for them to see her. "Then don't," Sarah said. "Let them go, build your life without them, you don't need them." "They're my family," I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded. "They've made it very clear that they're not," she replied. I didn't call them back. I didn't email. I didn't try to explain or defend myself. I simply stopped. My mother called the next day. I didn't answer. She called the day after that. Robert called. Marcus called, and his voicemail was confused and carefully concerned, like he was reaching out to someone who'd hurt him, not the other way around. I had my phone forwarded so that their calls and messages went directly to a folder I didn't have to see. This part of the story doesn't have the dramatic beats that betrayals usually have. There's no scene where I definitively tell them off. There's no moment where I say something cutting enough to scar them the way they'd scarred me. There's just silence. Just me, deciding that they didn't get to hurt me anymore, and that the best way to protect myself wasn't to fight them, but to stop fighting for them. I poured myself into work. I did extra shifts. I volunteered for the worst cases, the ones that burned out other doctors. I became the person who would take the trauma that came in at 3 a.m., the person who could sit with a family member while they watched their loved one die, the person who never broke. And I was respected for it, and I was valued for it, and it was all built on me being the person my family had trained me to be, useful, strong, unaffected. Sarah noticed. Diana noticed. They started gently suggesting that maybe I should take some time off, that maybe I should go to therapy, that maybe I shouldn't be working 70-hour weeks just because it was easier than being alone. "I'm fine," I said. I wasn't fine, but I was functioning, which is what I'd learned to do a very long time ago. 6 months after my mother's phone call, after I'd successfully erased my family from my active life, I got an email from my father. He didn't know what had happened. My mother and Robert hadn't told him, but he'd noticed that I'd stopped coming home for Christmas, that I wasn't responding to his calls, that something had shifted. "Natalie," he wrote, "I don't know what happened with your mother and Robert, but I want you to know that whatever it is, I'm on your side. I've always been on your side, even when I wasn't there physically. You're my daughter, that doesn't change." I cried at work, in the bathroom, for 5 minutes, then I washed my face and went back to the emergency room. I called him that night and we talked for 3 hours. He told me about his wife, about the life he'd built, about the fact that he'd always been proud of me, even from a distance. He told me that he'd gotten a phone call from my mother asking him to encourage me to reconcile with the family, and that he'd told her no, that she'd made her choice and I had the right to make mine. You don't owe them anything, he said. Not anymore, you tried, you were there, you saved their son, you were a good daughter, that was never the problem. The problem was that they weren't good parents. This should have fixed something. This should have been the moment where I realized I had someone who believed in me, who saw me, who was proud. And it was, in some small way. But by then, I'd built walls that weren't going to come down just because someone finally showed up. A year went by, then 2 years. I made attending and got hired at a prestigious teaching hospital. I started mentoring younger residents the way Sarah had mentored me. I published papers on emergency medicine protocols. I got commendations from the hospital. I was, by any objective measure, successful. And I was also slowly burning out without admitting it to myself. It was Sarah who finally said it. You're going to die if you keep going like this. That's dramatic, I said. You're not sleeping. You're not eating properly. You're working yourself into a state where you're not going to be able to function. And for what? To prove to people who already decided you weren't worth knowing that you're worth something. I'm not trying to prove anything to them, I said. Then stop running from them, Sarah replied. Stop letting them haunt you by working 80-hour weeks. Stop letting them take your present in exchange for your past. So I tried. I cut back my hours. I agreed to see a therapist. I got better at the kind of self-care that doesn't mean bubble baths but means actually, genuinely taking care of myself. I went on a date. I got into a relationship with someone who was kind and saw me and wanted to be in my life. I built things that were just for me, not to prove something or fill a hole that someone else had made. It wasn't healing exactly, but it was moving forward. 5 years after the phone call, I was 34 years old. I'd been estranged from my mother and stepfather for 5 years, and from Marcus for nearly as long. They existed in my mind like characters in a story I'd closed the book on, present in my memory but not in my life. I'd been back to Portland exactly twice in those years, once for my father's 55th birthday, where I helped him throw a party, and once for a medical conference. I didn't go to the house. I didn't call anyone. I existed in my father's portion of the world and left everything else alone. And then it was a Tuesday night, and I was working a shift at the teaching hospital, and the EMTs brought someone in from a single-car accident, and it was Marcus. He was conscious, which was immediately a good sign. He was alert, responsive, but he had a laceration on his head that was bleeding heavily, and his left arm was bent at an angle that suggested multiple fractures. The EMTs had done a good job stabilizing him, but he needed imaging and a surgical consult. I made the professional assessment, asked the standard questions, started him on the path through the emergency room that would eventually lead to whatever came next. It wasn't until he was having his head CT that the nurse brought me his wallet information for the records, and I saw his name, and I realized. He was still looking at the ceiling during the CT, so he hadn't seen me yet. Sarah was in the hospital that night. She'd taken a position at the same teaching hospital 2 years prior, and we worked together frequently. I paged her to the trauma bay. We have a patient, I said. He's my stepbrother. She didn't ask questions. She just said, do you need to take yourself off this case? No, I said, it was true. By training, by temperament, and by something deeper than both, by the doctor's oath to put the patient first, I was going to see this through. His scans came back. Head injury, but not as severe as Marcus's was 5 years ago. Broken arm, broken ribs, lacerations that needed attention. He would recover. He would be fine. When I went in to talk to him, to explain what the imaging showed and what the plan was, he was looking up at the ceiling, and then I was in his field of vision, and I watched recognition move through him like a physical force. Natalie, he said, like he wasn't sure if he was hallucinating. Hi, I said. I kept my voice professional, warm but professional, the voice I use with patients. I'm one of the attending physicians here. You've been in a car accident. You're going to be okay, but I want to walk you through what we found. He stared at me for a moment, and I watched the confusion work its way across his face. This was his sister, his stepsister technically, but his sister. He hadn't seen me in 5 years, and now I was here in a white coat, standing over his hospital bed, treating him like a stranger. I tried to call you, he said. After the thing with my marriage, you stopped answering. Your mother said you were angry with us. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I walked him through his CT results, his fractures, his treatment plan. I explained that he'd need to be admitted, that orthopedics would evaluate his arm, that he'd be in the hospital for at least a few days. I want you to rest, I said, using the same tone I use with every patient. We've given you pain medication. You're going to feel tired. That's normal, just sleep. We'll reassess in the morning. I left the room before he could ask anything else. I went to the doctor's lounge, and I sat down in one of the chairs, and I did something I hadn't done since I was a medical student. I let myself feel the full weight of the moment. This was the person I'd loved in a sibling way. This was the person I'd watched suffer and tried to help. This was the person who'd called me a predator so that he wouldn't have to look at his own behavior, so that his mother would come down on his side instead of his wife's. And now he was my patient. Sarah found me 5 minutes later. You okay? She asked. No, I said, but I will be. I'm going to treat him like I'd treat anyone else. I'm going to make sure he recovers, and then I'm going to let him go. That's what I did. Marcus stayed in the hospital for 4 days. I saw him on rounds every morning. I checked his CT again after the first 24 hours to make sure there was no secondary bleeding. I consulted with orthopedics about his arm. I prescribed pain medication and antibiotics and made sure he was comfortable and healing properly. On the second day, he asked me to come back in after I'd finished with the other patients. He was alone in his room, his arm in a cast, his ribs taped. I want to apologize, he said, for what happened, for how I handled the thing with Sarah. I was in a bad place and I let my mother convince me that. I don't even know what she convinced me of. That wasn't fair to you. I stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in 5 years. He was older, worn down by his divorce, by whatever had happened after we'd stopped talking. He looked like someone who'd learned that life was harder than he'd thought. Okay, I said. Is that it? He asked. I apologized and you're just okay. What do you want me to say? I asked. You want me to forgive you so that you can feel better about yourself. I'm not here to absolve you. I'm here to make sure your injuries heal. Once you're discharged, I'm hoping not to see you in this hospital again. Natalie, you believed your mother over me. You let her convince you that I was predatory. And then you went along with her plan to cut me out of the family. I don't care if you're sorry. I stopped caring about that a long time ago. I left the room. That night, after I got off shift, I sat in my apartment with Sarah and Diana, and I told them what had happened. How do you feel? Diana asked, because Diana was a therapist, and that's what therapists do, ask you how you feel. Empty, I said. Like I thought this would be this huge cathartic moment. Like when I finally saw him again it would mean something, but it doesn't. He's just a patient I'm treating. He's just a guy who got in an accident and broke his arm. He's not my brother. He stopped being my brother 5 years ago. Do you think he'll try to contact your mother? Sarah asked. To tell her you treated him? Probably, I said. And I'm sure she'll call or try to call. And I'm sure she'll use this as a way to try to get back in, to rebuild the relationship. And I'm sure that when she does I'll feel nothing, because I've spent 5 years feeling nothing. That's not true, Diana said gently. You feel something, you're just choosing not to let it matter anymore. There's a difference. I considered this while Sarah went to get wine, while Diana made snacks, while we settled into the evening in the way that families who actually choose each other do. Marcus was discharged on his 5th day. His arm would heal. His ribs would hurt for a few weeks but would eventually stop. He'd have a scar on his head but it would fade with time. He'd recover. He'd go back to his life. He'd probably call his mother and tell her that I'd treated him professionally, that I'd been kind, that I hadn't let our history interfere with his medical care. And she would probably call me. She called 3 days later. I was at work in the middle of a shift, and when I saw her number on my phone, I did what I'd done for 5 years. I didn't answer. But this time she left a voicemail. Natalie, it's Mom. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to reach out. Marcus told me about his accident and about how you took care of him and how professional you were. That meant so much to him. It meant a lot to me too. I've been thinking about what happened and I want to talk about it. I want to understand where I went wrong. I want to try. I don't know if you're willing to, but I'm asking. Please call me back. I deleted the message without responding. But that night I told my father about the voicemail. I didn't plan to. It just came out over dinner. He'd come to visit, and I was telling him about work, about Marcus's recovery, about everything. She said she wants to understand where she went wrong, I told him. But she doesn't actually understand. She thinks this is about her being a bad parent. It's not. It's about her choosing him over me because he was her golden child, and I was too much of a reminder that her marriage to Robert came at a cost to me. So what are you going to do? My father asked. Nothing, I said. I'm going to keep not answering. I'm going to let her feel rejected the way I felt rejected. I'm going to let her sit with the idea that she might have lost her daughter for good. He nodded, taking this in. And when she keeps calling, he asked, because she will keep calling, your mother is persistent. Then she can keep calling, I said. But I'm done. I'm done trying. I'm done being the person who bridges the gap. I'm done being the one who fixes things and saves people and makes myself useful to people who don't deserve me. My father reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I'm proud of you, he said. Not for the success, though I'm proud of that too. I'm proud that you're finally putting yourself first. That took a long time to learn, but you learned it. She did keep calling. Over the next month she called 7 times. I didn't answer any of them. She left voicemails, each one trying a different approach. Apology, explanation, softness, firmness, everything except the one thing that would have actually mattered, which was genuine recognition of what she'd done. Then one day she called and I almost answered because the thought crossed my mind that maybe, finally, she'd figured out what she needed to say. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail. I'm not going to call again, she said, and something in her voice had changed. There was finality in it, a kind of sad acceptance. I've spent 5 years trying to understand what I did wrong, and I think I finally know. I think I was afraid of you. Your life is so different from what I expected. Your girlfriend, your success, your independence, it all scared me because it was so far from the path I thought you'd take. And instead of being happy for you, I let that fear turn into judgment. I let Robert and Marcus tell me what to think about you because it was easier than examining my own beliefs. You were right. I failed you as a mother. And I'm sorry, I don't expect you to forgive me. But I wanted you to know that I understand it now. I hope you're happy. I hope you're really happy because you deserve that. And if you ever want to talk, I'm here, but I understand if you don't. She hung up. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and listened to that message 5 times. I felt something move in me, not forgiveness but recognition. She'd finally said something true. She'd finally seen something real about herself and about me. I didn't call her back. But I didn't delete the message either. Over the next few months I thought about it. Not constantly, but it was there, living in my phone, existing as a possibility. I thought about what would happen if I called her back. I thought about what it would mean to say yes to reconciliation, and I thought about what it would mean to keep saying no. Sarah asked me once if I was ever going to respond. I don't know, I said. If I do, it has to be on my terms. It can't be about fixing things for her or making her feel better or going back to the way things were. If there's any future with her, it has to be completely different from what it was before. What would that look like? Sarah asked. I don't know, I said. I'd have to think about it. And I did think about it. For months, I thought about what I wanted from my family, what I was willing to accept, what would be the minimum requirement for moving forward without compromising myself. I decided that the conditions were genuine understanding of what she'd done, real apologies without excuses, acknowledgement of how much she'd hurt me, willingness to work on the relationship rather than just expect me to accept her love unconditionally, and most importantly, acceptance of who I was with no asterisks or caveats. I wasn't sure she could meet all of those conditions, but I was willing to find out. So I called her back. We talked for an hour. It wasn't easy. There were moments where she started to go into explanations that felt more like defenses, and I had to stop her and say, I need you to just acknowledge that you did this. There were moments where I had to cry, which I wasn't expecting. There were moments where she cried, which felt worse because I still didn't know if it was genuine or performative. But something shifted in the conversation. I want to try, she said. If you're willing, not to go back to how things were but to start new, to figure out who we are to each other now. You don't owe me that, but I'm asking. I'll try, I said, but it's going to take time, and it's going to require you to prove through actions, not words, that you actually want this. Okay, she said, thank you, that's more than I deserve. We started small. Phone calls every 2 weeks instead of weekly. Text messages that were just checking in, no pressure. She asked about my work, and she actually listened to the answers instead of waiting for her turn to talk about Marcus or Robert or herself. Robert sent a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which shocked me because I didn't think Robert had the self-awareness to apologize for anything. In it, he acknowledged that he'd let his loyalty to Marcus interfere with his relationship with me. He said he was sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he was sorry and he meant it. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it. Marcus called me at work, which was both brave and stupid. Sarah looked at me with a question on her face as I answered. Hey, he said, I know you're probably busy, but I wanted to talk to you about something other than my broken arm. Okay, I said, stepping out of the emergency room into the hallway. I've been in therapy, he said. Real therapy, not the kind where you just talk about what's wrong with everyone else. And I realized that I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself. I knew I was sleeping with my wife's sister. I knew that was my fault. But instead of dealing with it, I let my mother convince me that the issue was with you and Sarah, that you were corrupting me or whatever. That was bullshit and I'm sorry. Okay, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. I don't expect you to forgive me, he continued. I don't expect us to be close again, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did and I'm sorry for doing it. Thank you for saying that, I said, and I meant it. Slowly, imperceptibly, something began to rebuild. My mother started asking me about the relationship I was in, not with fear or judgment, but with genuine curiosity about the woman I cared about. She asked to meet her, and Sarah and I agreed to fly out to Portland for Thanksgiving, my first family Thanksgiving in 5 years. It wasn't perfect. It was awkward. My mother had made too much food out of nervousness. Robert didn't know how to talk to me beyond small talk about work. Marcus was trying very hard, which I appreciated, but which also made things feel performative. But there was real effort happening. There was a choice being made over and over again by all of us to be present despite the difficulty. By Christmas, I felt different. Not healed, that feels like too final a word. Not forgiven because that's not really what either of us needed. But something had shifted from a no to a maybe, from a closed door to a door that was slightly ajar. My mother asked if I'd come home for a few days. I said yes. When I got there, the house was different. Not physically, it was still the same house I'd grown up in with the same furniture and the same layout. But emotionally it felt smaller, less haunted. The hallway of Marcus's soccer photos was different too. They were still there, but now there was a new photo, me in my white coat standing in front of the hospital, the day I made attending. My mother had printed it and framed it and hung it right next to his athletic achievements. I'm sorry it took me this long, she said when she saw me looking at it. I know, I said, and I let myself believe her. We sat down to dinner that night, the 4 of us plus my father who'd come for the holiday. There were 4 plates on the table and 4 people sitting around it. It wasn't a perfect family photo. My relationship with Robert was still rebuilding. My relationship with Marcus was still fragile and cautious. My relationship with my mother was built on new ground that neither of us fully understood yet. But we were there, we were choosing to be there, and that meant something. After dinner, after my father had gone home and Robert had gone to bed, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table with wine that neither of us really wanted, and we talked. I want to explain something, she said, and I need you to just listen because I know you don't owe me understanding, but I need you to know why I did what I did. When you came out, when you told me about Sarah, I realized that you'd become someone I didn't understand. You'd built a life that looked nothing like the life I'd imagined for you, and instead of being happy for you, I was scared. I was scared that I'd failed you somehow, that I hadn't taught you the right way to be, that my marriage to Robert had somehow broken something in you that needed to be fixed. I was never broken, I said quietly. I know that now, she said, but I didn't know it then. I thought that if I could convince you that you were wrong about yourself, that you were confused about your life, then I could fix the thing I thought I'd broken. And when you wouldn't listen to me, when you kept living your life the way you wanted to, I got angry. I felt rejected, and your brother, Marcus, provided a way out of that. He gave me a reason to think that it wasn't me who was the problem, it was you. It was your influence, your alternative lifestyle, your selfishness. It was easier to blame you than to examine my own beliefs. I listened to this and I felt the truth in it. I wasn't sure if I was ready to absolve her of it, but I understood it. I've been reading about why parents reject their LGBTQ children, she continued, and I realized that I was following a very common script. I was so afraid of what other people would think that I was willing to push my own daughter away. I was more concerned with how your father would judge me, with whether Robert would think I'd failed as a mother, than I was with actually knowing my own daughter. And I lost you. For 5 years I lost you because I was afraid. You lost me a long time before that, I said, and it wasn't meant to be unkind. You lost me when you chose Marcus over me when I was 8 years old. You lost me every time you looked at his accomplishments and treated them like they were evidence of your worth as a mother. You lost me every time I tried to matter to you and you looked through me like I wasn't there. She nodded and her eyes were full of tears. I know, she said. I know that, and I can't fix that. I can't give you back the years I spent not seeing you. I can't make it so that you didn't have to build your entire sense of worth on becoming a doctor and saving people and proving yourself to a family that had already decided you weren't worth knowing. But I can stop doing that now. I can see you now. I can be present for the person you've become. That's all I can do. Okay, I said, and I meant it. We didn't hug, we didn't have some big reconciliation moment, but we sat together at the kitchen table and we acknowledged what had happened and we agreed to try again. That was enough. The next morning I got a call from the hospital. One of my residents had called in sick and they needed me to cover the shift. I'd already committed to being home for the next 2 days, but this was an emergency. I have to go, I told my mother. She nodded and she understood, because by then she understood what my work meant to me. It wasn't just a job. It was the thing that had saved me. It was the place where I was seen and valued and mattered, and she wasn't going to ask me to choose between her and that. I drove back to Boston that afternoon, and I worked the night shift, saving lives in the way I'd learned to do, the way I'd become excellent at doing. And when I came home the next morning, I called my mother, and I told her I'd made it back safely. I'm glad, she said. And Natalie, I'm proud of you, not because you're a doctor, because you're someone who keeps showing up for people even when it's hard, even when you don't have to. That's the person you've always been. I just finally learned to see it. It's been 3 years since that Thanksgiving, since my mother and I decided to start rebuilding. It hasn't been a straight line. There have been moments where we've regressed, where old patterns have tried to creep back in. There have been phone calls that went badly, conversations where I had to set boundaries that she initially resisted, moments where I wondered if this was all just temporary, if we'd eventually slip back into the familiar dance of distance and disappointment. But we've also had real moments of connection. She's taken the time to get to know me, not the version of me that's convenient or makes sense to her, but the actual person I am. She's met my girlfriend multiple times. She's asked genuine questions about my work. She's supported me through difficult cases and celebrated my successes with a pride that feels real, not performance. My father and I have also rebuilt our relationship. He comes to Boston occasionally and we have dinner together and we talk about real things. He tells me about his life and I tell him about mine, and there's no weight of obligation hanging over any of it. He just shows up. He's there. Robert and I have come to a kind of truce. He's not going to be my favorite person, and I don't think we'll ever have a deep relationship. But he's been trying in his way to acknowledge his role in what happened. He's supported my mother through therapy. He's worked on his own understanding of why he'd been so willing to believe the worst about me. He's not the villain I needed him to be, but he's also not the irredeemable figure I'd made him out to be in my mind. And Marcus is complicated. We're not close. We probably never will be, not in the way that siblings who have grown up together are close. But we found a way to exist in the same family system without the old dynamics recreating themselves. He's still in therapy. He's built a new life after his divorce, and he's learned to see his role in what happened instead of just being the golden child who got to make mistakes without consequences. More importantly, he's learned to see me. I still work at the same hospital. I've become a mentor to residents, the way Sarah was a mentor to me. I've published more papers. I've been offered leadership positions that I've considered and sometimes declined because I've learned that success isn't about constant climbing. Sometimes it's about knowing when you're exactly where you want to be. Sarah is still my person. She always will be. Diana is still there, still being the kind of person who asks how you feel and actually cares about the answer. They're the chosen family that saved me when my biological family couldn't see me. And I've learned to be okay with the fact that my family didn't come save me. I came and saved myself. I built a life that was so good, so full, so rich with meaning and connection, that eventually my family had to admit that I wasn't the problem. I was the solution. I was the one who'd figured it out. I was the one who'd become excellent at something real. My name is Natalie, and I am a doctor. I am the person who shows up in the middle of the night to save your life. I am the person who sits with your fear and meets you there. I am the person my mother finally learned to see. I am the person my stepbrother learned to respect. I am the person my father was always proud of, even when no one else was. And I am finally, after all of this, enough on my own terms. The truth doesn't expire. It doesn't matter if it takes 5 days or 5 years, or if you have to say it 5 times before someone finally hears you. The truth will eventually break through, because truth has a weight to it that lies can never match. And the person you become in the process of survival, that person is stronger than anyone who tries to diminish you will ever understand. I still think about what my mother said, about how she was afraid of me. I understand that fear now in a way I didn't before. I understand that sometimes people are afraid of the people they love most, because loving them means admitting something about yourself that you're not ready to admit. My mother was afraid that she'd failed me, that my queerness was somehow evidence of her inadequacy as a parent. And rather than sit with that fear, rather than examine it, she tried to convince me that I was the problem. It took her 5 years to realize that the only problem was her willingness to believe the lie. I don't know if she fully forgives herself for those 5 years. I think some things you carry forever, the ways you failed someone, the time you lost, the hurt you caused. But I do know that she's trying now to be better. She's trying to see me as I actually am, not as a reflection of her failures or her fears. And that's all anyone can ask. My girlfriend, her name is Rebecca, and I've been with her for 2 years, asked me recently if I ever regret cutting my family off. Not in a judgmental way, but in a real way, like she genuinely wanted to know. No, I said, because I couldn't have survived staying connected to them at that time. I needed to be alone. I needed to build something just for me, something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's approval or disapproval. And I did that. I built a life so good that eventually they wanted to be part of it again. That's the difference. I didn't wait for them to give me permission to matter. I just mattered. And then they had to deal with that. Is that why you're such a good doctor? She asked. I'd never thought about it that way, but maybe she was right. Maybe the fact that I'd learned to matter to myself first meant that I could help other people matter to themselves. Maybe the fact that I'd survived invisibility meant that I could recognize it in others and help shine a light. Maybe the fact that I'd walked away from my family meant that I could sit with patients who were doing the same thing, without judgment, without telling them they should forgive too soon. The emergency room is where all of us end up eventually, all of us who have been broken in some way. Who have been hurt or hurt ourselves or just collided with the randomness of being alive. And I get to be the person who shows up in that moment and says, "You're going to be okay," not because everything will be perfect, but because you're going to survive this and you're going to learn something from it, and you're going to become someone your 8-year-old self never would have dared to imagine. That's the gift that my family's rejection gave me. It gave me empathy that I wouldn't have had otherwise. It gave me humility. It gave me the ability to sit with people in their worst moments and meet them there without trying to fix it, or minimize it, or tell them that they should forgive too soon. My name is Natalie, and I'm 29 years old, and I spent the first 24 years of my life trying to matter to people who couldn't see me. And then I spent the next 5 years deciding that I didn't need them to see me, that I could matter to myself, that was enough. And now I spend my days seeing people, really seeing them, in the emergency room in the moment when they're most vulnerable and most real. And I tell them the way I wish someone had told my younger self, "You're going to be okay," not because your family will come back, not because you'll get the apology you deserve, not because everything will work out the way you planned, but because you're stronger than you think, and you're going to build a life so good that eventually people will want to be part of it, and you get to decide whether to let them in. That's the real story, that's the thing that matters. It's not about the betrayal, though the betrayal was real. It's not about the reconciliation, though that happened too. It's about the woman I became in between, the one who had to learn that her worth wasn't dependent on someone else's recognition of it, the one who had to build her own family, set her own boundaries, and decide that she was enough. 4 plates on the table, that's what I said I needed. 4 plates, which meant my mother, my stepfather, my stepbrother, and me, all sitting down to dinner at the same table. And we did that. We do that now occasionally when I go home for holidays or long weekends. But I don't need the 4 plates anymore. I have 2 people I love, Rebecca and Sarah, my girlfriend and my sister, not by blood but by choice. I have my father, who showed up when everyone else had walked away. I have colleagues at the hospital who respect me and learn from me and know me in a way that my family never did. And I have myself, the person I became through medicine and determination and the refusal to accept invisibility as a permanent state. That's enough, that's more than enough, that's everything.